You're watching a production of South Dakota Public Broadcasting.
State House program funding provided by the South Dakota Bar Foundation, the educational and charitable arm of South Dakota lawyers and judges.
Thanks, Bailey, and thanks everyone in the room and on the phone for joining for this conference. I have three things I'd like to address before we open up for questions I thought you might be interested in. I mentioned in the State of the State I'll be introducing a bill to facilitate licensed professionals to move from state to state between states that are signatories to a licensure compact. We'll be introducing that compact next week. I've been speaking on the phone again to some Western governors with whom I visited last year about this. I spoke with Governor Mead, and then just this week again with Governor Bullock of Montana, Mead of Wyoming, and both remain supportive. I've got a call with Governor Hickenlooper of Colorado tomorrow. After a opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal that was jointly written by myself and Secretary Acosta, U.S. Labor Secretary Acosta, we saw some interest from Arizona, which has introduced this compact there, and we are also expecting the same thing in Missouri. Again, saw this in the Wall Street Journal and liked the concept, called us about it, and so it may get some legs in states where I've really not been involved. We've also been meeting with some of the professions and associations and legislators to answer questions about it, and that's one of the reasons why it hasn't been introduced yet. We want to make sure we can address any concerns and adapt the language to identify any and correct any issues to the extent we can, and so we're hopeful that'll find success in the process. A second topic, both the House and the Senate have now passed unanimously an appropriations bill to construct the Madison Cyber Labs, excuse me, at Dakota State University. And oftentimes the Appropriations Committee will give authority to the Board of Regents to build buildings on various campuses, but there's often not a lot of public awareness of where the funding comes from for those buildings. In this case, the reverse is true. It's been very public that this is part of the generous gift from Miles and Lisa Beacom and Denny Sanford, and also some future fund dollars that is covering, along with lots of scholarship money and faculty money, it's covering the construction of this building. So I know the Dakota State University leadership is very pleased about how rapidly this went through the Senate. It's got an emergency clause, so as soon as I sign it, it'll become law and they can start construction this spring. And that's that project is an $18 million project, including demolition of Lowry Hall and construction of the brand new Cyber Labs building. The third topic is a little bit more obscure. Excuse me. As you know, a few years ago, it came to light that Volkswagen had been altering its vehicles so that the pollution defeating equipment would not function as it should, and they were disguising the emissions results to cover up that fact, and of course were found to be doing so, and as a consequence of a legal settlement, there's a fair amount of money now that is being paid to the Environmental Protection Agency, and some of that money will find its way to the states and to other beneficiaries. The notice from the deadline by which the trustee must officially designate beneficiaries is next week. And South Dakota last November submitted the documentation we needed to submit to validate ourselves as a appropriate beneficiary, and so we expect to be validated next week. South Dakota's share, if we are so validated, will be about $8 million, slightly over $8 million over 10 years. We need to submit a plan about how we spend the money, and the plan must essentially commit to choose one of 10 methods by which we would spend that money. And all of those methods are essentially aimed at reducing emissions, essentially offsetting the increased diesel emissions that occurred when Volkswagen altered its vehicles. So it's such things as replacing school buses or transit vehicles or trucks or other kinds of emission-creating sources with newer, more modern equipment that emits fewer of such emissions. So up to a third of that $8 million could be paid out in the first year, so that would be about $2.7 million. We could ask as early as April of this year for the first 1/3 of the money. The second payment through the second year could then plan to spend up to 2/3 of the $10 million or the $8 million. So that would be again $5.4 million through the first and second years collectively. And again, it has to be spent on a plan that reduces emissions. So we have been taking comments, and so if you want and are interested in more detail, you can go to the DENR, the Environment and Natural Resources website. There'll be, if you look under air quality, you'll find a link to all the comments. And it is interesting. You'll see there's proposals to replace school buses with propane-driven buses or electric buses, proposals to install electric charging stations. Some of the money, I think, will be definitely spent on electric charging stations, not state-driven money, but other money that the state does not control will already be spent that way. But that's another way that a state could also spend the money. Another third way, Congress has a program right now through which it has been distributing money to the state. It has to be matched. And that money, again, is used to reduce emissions. And so we might combine that old money with this new money and essentially enlarge an existing program. That's one of the 10 options that's offered as clearly okay. So anyway, I thought you might be interested in that. It's topical in the sense that it's we expect to be recognized as a beneficiary next week. And then at that point, we'll start seriously making some decisions and taking some public comment about those proposals that are listed on the website and making some decisions about how we want to spend this money. With that, I'll open up to any questions on any topic at all. Excuse me.
Speaker Mickelson has put out sort of a four-piece proposal to repeal Marcy's Law from the Constitution and beef up statutes regarding victims' rights. Do you support that proposal? Have you spoken with him about it?
I have not spoken with him about it. I was aware he was looking at that, and I did see in scanning the new bill introductions here in the recent days, I saw a package of bills come through, and I do conceptually support it. I think allowing the voters to decide would they be satisfied with repealing that aspect of the constitutional amendment that was passed. I don't know to what degree the public paid attention to the unintended consequences that flowed from that amendment. I know the press is aware because it certainly made your job a little difficult at the outset, much more difficult, still a little bit more difficult to get accident reports, to get crime victims details as you were able to get in the past. I hope this provides better protections for victims. I know one of the bills enlarges the Victims' Compensation Fund Crime Victims Compensation Fund. So I think the plan is pretty good. It's really up to the voters, and they'll have a chance to make a decision. Again, I think if you recall that Marcy's Law was promoted almost entirely by outside money, and again was a pretty complicated and lengthy piece of amendment to our Constitution, which is a document not easily adjusted or corrected if there are unintended consequences or errors. I think it's a good proposal that I hope the voters will consider.
The Speaker has also brought a resolution that would essentially remove voters from, or prevent them from referring amendments, constitutional amendments to the ballot. That would be left up to lawmakers. Would you support that proposal? It would, again, fall to the voters ultimately. I
think it would be, you mean an absolute prohibition from referral? I don't know that the voters would support that. I think that's highly unlikely.
It would say that the voters can initiate a constitutional amendment.
Right. I think it's highly unlikely the voters would deprive themselves of that power. I do know there's a bill to raise the voting threshold from 50% to 55%, and I think some voters would agree, and I agree, that that is something worth considering. We have higher voter thresholds for things like long-term bonds, long-term borrowing, that sort of thing. When you're making a decision that is very significant and difficult to revise, as constitutional amendments, you can't revise them but every 2 years. It's probably good to make it a little more difficult to get oneself in that situation.
The Interstate Licensure Compact that you've been working with several Western governors with, I guess, what are you hoping that does? Are you hoping it brings in more professionals into the state? And are you concerned that it could, maybe go the opposite way as well?
I don't think it would go if everyone heard the question, I don't think the Interstate Compact would impair mobility of professionals. I think it would improve mobility. I don't think it would cause any professionals to leave South Dakota. I can't imagine why it would. We have demand for hundreds of nurses, for example, and if this would allow a nurse to come to South Dakota and gain his or her license more quickly and start the practice, especially in the area of the sciences, how to take blood pressure shouldn't be a whole lot different from one state to another. The boiling point of water is the same everywhere. So I would think, especially in the sciences, there's probably a relative agreement among the states about what a person should know, and hopefully this will achieve better mobility among the states. So I'm hopeful it'll help with some of our shortage of professionals.
Senator Jensen has brought a few proposals aiming to eliminate the need for licensure for interpreters for the deaf, for barbers, for cosmetologists who want to wash hair, among other things. Do you support those proposals, and where do you think we need to draw a line as a state as to what needs to be a licensed position and what does not?
I think whenever we look at whether to license a profession or not, we need to examine what is the public benefit or danger that is avoided if a license is put in place. And so certainly among the healthcare professions, we want to be sure to avoid disease, do no harm, be sure that licensed professionals meet a certain level of standard, and then that license is essentially the state's seal of approval that the professional has met those standards that give confidence in the buying public that they can safely use that professional. In some cases, though, you'll have some of these licensure measures that demand a certain demand a higher than necessary level, and that is, I think, in some cases it can be a subjective thing. So it's hard to say that any one person knows with certainty what the right level is, but last year I know we repealed the requirement that a person be a licensed cosmetologist to do hair braiding. I think the general public would feel comfortable that they're not greatly threatened by someone who braids hair without a license. I think to the extent that Senator Jensen saying you should be able to shampoo hair without a license, again, I'm not threatened. It doesn't strike fear in my heart that someone might wash my hair without having been properly trained on how to apply soap and water. So those are kind of the extreme ends of how licensure can be a little bit more restrictive than it is protective. And so where you draw that line, I'm sure reasonable people can differ.
There's also a proposal that would bar people who are living in the U.S. illegally from attending state colleges or receiving financial aid. Is that something that you would support?
You know, I don't know how that would impact our public institutions and how that's being managed today or how it would be enforced. So I'd want to hear from the Board of Regents about that before making any judgment about whether that's a good or bad thing.
Governor, a number of gun bills have dropped again this year, one of which is permitless carry. To my read, it looks very, very similar from that was passed in the House and Senate and ultimately vetoed by you last year, if not identical to the bill last year. Do you have any plans with this, if passed again, would you plan to veto it again? And then a follow-up.
Yeah, I do continue to believe our concealed carry permits are helpful in providing some level of protection against concealed carry or even possession by people with mental issues or intoxication issues or past crimes that would make them ineligible. Many people are unaware of the prohibitions that apply to them and are willing to undertake the procedure, and once denied, of course, law enforcement is alerted to the fact that these people would like to carry concealed. And I think those two things, I think, have some benefit in public safety. Against that, you have to weigh the burden on the individual who is law-abiding and certainly qualified to carry concealed, and what is the burden to them to get a concealed permit. And I think the burden is very light, very light. And so given the safety factor that we see as a consequence of our current law and the very light burden, I don't see any reason why I would support this bill. And so would I veto it? Yes, I would. I'm sure the sponsors know that.
Then the follow-up on that is a separate bill from that dropped as well that would allow certain felons, convicted felons, to apply. Would that be, how do you feel about that, certain convicted felons being able to apply for pistol?
Now, I confess I don't know as much about that bill. I need to understand, because I know there are both state and federal laws that govern the degree to which a felon can carry. At the same time, I also know what is or is not a felony changes day to day. And in some cases, one person might think this sort of behavior is worthy of a felony charge, and another person might think that sort of same behavior should be a misdemeanor, and yet, even though those people differ, it's the same behavior. And so I'd want to understand exactly the nature of the bill. I don't reject it out of hand because I want to understand it, and it might be something I'd be perfectly happy with too. So I don't know the answer to that question. I need to look at the bill and understand better than I do.
Governor, Senator Novstrup and Representative Haugaard brought Senate Bill 110, which essentially says Planned Parenthood isn't complying with state law for informed consent prior to performing abortions, and it adds some additional authority to pregnancy health centers. Have you read the bill? Do you have any thoughts on it?
I have not read that bill. I'm sorry. I don't have any thoughts on it because I haven't read it, and I haven't even read about it. So I saw a headline, I think it was in the Argus, with Representative Norstrup's picture and something about Planned Parenthood, but I didn't read the story. So I need to educate myself about that bill.
There's a proposal that would require drug testing for all legislators. I think it's a law. So would you sign that?
I think it's sort of silly myself, but if the legislature wants to do that for itself or to itself, you know, I wouldn't oppose them, but I don't know what that would cost and how it would be implemented, and really, I haven't seen any problem like that. I haven't seen any indications in my interaction with the legislature that give me cause to suspect any of them have a drug problem, but maybe I'm oblivious.
Representative Goodwin also has a bill that would allow military members who are 18 to buy alcohol at a bar from a store. Is that something you would consider?
I might be wrong, but I'm pretty certain that would cause problems with transportation funding. I might be wrong about that. I think there might be federal law that conditions our receipt of federal gas taxes to laws that restrict alcohol to 21 and older, as well as the 0.08 or lower blood alcohol content. I'm pretty sure that's federal law driven, and while we can choose to ignore that law, the consequence is that choice loses us about $300 million of federal gas tax. So that's a lot of money.
Take this moment to turn over to the phones if anyone has a question. All right, back to the room.
Senator Sutton today talked about bringing some sort of transparency legislation, perhaps opening up public officials' correspondence for as public records. I think maybe he said the Newspaper Association would have something like that. Is that something you would consider?
I'd certainly look at it. In the states that I've heard have more access to public officials' records, the exceptions to that general rule often consume it. And so I wonder if the access is more apparent than real. I also think that once someone knows that people are looking over their shoulder, they start to act differently. And so the consequence of that sort of law might just drive communication to telephone or face-to-face, or I just don't know that it achieves the end that people think it achieves. Maybe it does. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I'd look at it. I'd sure look at it.
Senator Heiner, I believe the bill was just filed today, brought a proposal to make it a criminal offense to use a catheter on someone without their consent. That's something that was occurring. Law enforcement were obtaining urine to test it for drug content. Is that something that you would support, or do you think that that venue should be allowed for law enforcement?
That's certainly an invasive way. I'd have to look at the language of that bill to make sure it's very, very narrow. if I'm unconscious, I'd want somebody to be able to catheterize me if it's in my best interest. So, as an example, you want to be sure it's very narrowly drawn. And I'm not sure what the law is now. I think there's been some court cases that maybe disallowed that already, and I'm never excited about adding to statute something that's already in law through case decisions or through another provision of statute elsewhere. So, I'd want to know whether that's the case also. Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks.
State House program funding provided by the South Dakota Bar Foundation, the educational and charitable arm of South Dakota lawyers and judges. Programming is made possible with your annual membership in the Friends of South Dakota Public Broadcasting. Additional funding provided by